Georgetown, Washington, D.C. She was weary. The last few days had been like a whirlwind, especially with Sean out of town. Only her excitement was sustaining her now. She had big news for Sean and her mother. Jessie had been at Georgetown since yesterday, buried in the library, researching little-known facts about the area, Mosby's Rangers, and Union troop movements in January 1865. She knew the month from the diaries. She had found the references that she needed and had the two fragile volumes, the one from the floor and the one from the valise, in her book bag. She had left the Georgetown Library in a rush after making headway, but finding the best research archives for the area in question were in the Handley Library in Winchester. She had sped her mother's blue BMW from Georgetown West on Route 50 to Winchester and spent the remainder of the day in the Handley Library basement, poring over a seemingly endless amount of material. But it had paid off. Things were falling together. She knew her mother had big news too. They had talked briefly the night before. Abby had since spent the beginning of the week tracking down and interviewing local historians, while Jessie had buried herself in the books. Jessie had called her mother from a friend's in a Georgetown dormitory room the night before. Her only news was that Sean was back and they had just had a big break, and she would finish up tomorrow. They'd know more by the next night when Sean's brother Eric was there. Sean wanted to keep everything close until Eric arrived so he could be part of it. Jessie thought that was nice, but it was driving her crazy not knowing what they had discovered, and not being able to tell what she herself had found out. Jessie was disappointed when she arrived home and found it dark in the early twilight. "Mama's probably at Sean's," she said to herself out loud. She knew she should have swung by there on the way from Winchester, but she needed to relax, shower, and didn't want to arrive looking like a slob when meeting Sean's brother for the first time, especially if he was as cute as Sean. The thought of Sean and her mother made her smile as she collected her book bag, taking care because of the fragile old diaries inside. "Mama deserves to be happy," she muttered, thinking how her mother positively glowed around Sean as she made her way to the front door. As she approached the front door, she sensed something was wrong, an instant before her mind registered the splintered door jambs. She looked closer, seeing the front door open, but thought better of it and retreated to her mother's car to call the police on her mother's car phone. After calmly giving the police the information, she hung up and hurriedly called Sean's number. No answer. Then she tried her grandparents. Again, no answer. Her weariness burned away with a new shot of adrenaline. She sat there fearing things she knew couldn't be, and imagining all sorts of silly things she knew couldn't possibly happen. She didn't know then how wrong she was. The next 5 minutes seemed like hours as she waited in the growing darkness. Finally, a police car slid silently into the driveway behind her. Jessie was out of the car in a second and hurrying back to the police car. There, the officer's cool professionalism calmed her. Yes, she was Jessie Deacon. Yes, she lived there with her mother. They asked more questions. She answered them impatiently, but calmly nonetheless. She knew everything was fine, now that the police were here. She sat in the cruiser as the two policemen approached the house, circling it first, flashlights playing across the yard and the outside of the house. After checking the outside, they cautiously approached the damaged front door, which one officer pushed open easily. They entered cautiously. Jessie saw their flashlights sweeping the interior. Then the light flipped on. A few minutes later, the officers returned, one getting on the radio, the other motioning her out of the cruiser and pulling her aside for more questions. Another car arrived. This one was unmarked. The officer spoke with the detective briefly. Then he came over and introduced himself to Jessie. He told her it seems there had been a break-in, and would she accompany him inside to see if anything had been stolen. Jessie gasped when she entered the front door. The house was in shambles. Furniture overturned, cushions sliced, pictures torn off the wall and shredded. They went from room to room, Jessie dismayed by it all. In the kitchen, drawers had been empty, food dumped, every room the same. Even the toothpaste tube had been emptied. Jessie had never seen anything like it. The detective called her to the kitchen, showing her a note on the refrigerator that had been left in place. Big news. Come to Sean's ASAP. It's as good as ours. Mom, you have any idea what this means? The detective asked, looking at Jessie appraisingly. No, Jessie said, shaking her head, trying not to give anything away. Only that she wanted me to go to Sean's. He's a guy she's been seeing him lately. Just moved out on Carter's Run Road, 10 miles or so outside of town. Sean Murphy's his name. I tried to call there as soon as I called y'all, but no answer. She shrugged, her mind racing, but not wanting to let on about the gold. I see, he said, not sounding at all convinced. We'll have more questions for you later, Miss Deacon, and you'll have to fill out a statement. That's okay, I understand. Will I have to do it tonight or can I do it tomorrow? She asked calmly. I'm afraid there's no time like the present, ma'am. You can start on your statement now if you'd like, and I'll get the questions when we're through snooping around. The polite detective nodded to one of the uniformed officers who had arrived first, and he volunteered to take Jessie out to the cruiser and get her started so she'd be out of the mess and not in the detective's way. Can I try and call my grandparents on the car phone before I get started, so I don't surprise them too bad when I show up? I can't stay here tonight, she asked, looking around at the mess. Sure, go ahead. Just come on back to the cruiser when you get done, the officer said, smiling reassuringly. As she punched the number into the phone, another police car and a van arrived. Several men carrying various sizes of cases marched like ants towards the front door. Jessie watched impassively as she listened to the phone ring again and again, wondering where they could be. Frustrated, she tried Sean's again. Again she heard the empty rings. With a sigh, Jessie got out of her mother's BMW and walked back to the cruiser. The officer smiled, handing her a clipboard with the proper form. You might be more comfortable in the back, he indicated, opening the door for her. Thanks. Just then a county sheriff's car arrived, stopping quickly enough to squeal its brakes. Both Jessie and the officer looked on curiously. The passenger door opened and Sheriff Colton jumped out, seemingly in a hurry. Evening, Sheriff, the officer said with a nod of his head, but Jessie's eyes were glued to the rear seat. In the light, as the door opened, she saw, sitting in the back, her grandparents. The strained look on their faces told the story. Something was dreadfully wrong. The sheriff hurried past Jessie and the officer into the house. Jessie rushed to the car. Her grandfather got out and wrapped his arms around her. What's wrong, Granddaddy? Something's happened, she demanded. She looked around his bear-like shoulder at her grandmother, sitting in the back seat like a statue, looking stricken. It's your mama, child, Cyrus said hauntingly into Jessie's ear, trying to choke back the tears. Jessie pulled away so she could look up into her grandfather's face. The big grumbling bear of a man stood there, face pale, eyes rimmed red from crying, unable to look his granddaughter in the eye. All of a sudden, everything fell into place. Jessie's eyes grew wide as an avalanche of emotions fell through her soul. No, she said in denial. It's not Mama. I'm sorry, child. Cyrus managed, unable to hold back the tears any longer. Jessie's eyes grew wide, and her own tears started flowing, understanding what her grandfather was saying as he wrapped his arms around her in comfort. No, she's just hurt bad or something, right? Jessie pleaded. No, child. She's gone. They both sobbed. Through the veil of tears, Jessie could see her grandmother still sitting motionless in the back seat as if drugged in a stupor. Grandmama, Jessie called, getting no reaction. She tried to pull away to go to her grandmother, but Cyrus held her tightly. Leave her be for now, child. She didn't take it well. The doctor had to give her something. We just got her calmed down before we came over here. At least you're okay. We feared the worst when we got the call on the radio, while the sheriff was taking us home from identifying the body. Cyrus choked. The two clung together, damp from their tears, gaining comfort from each other as much as giving it. Jessie sobbed into her grandfather's chest, slowly shaking her head in denial. What happened? Jessie pleaded. We don't rightly know, her grandfather managed, straining for control. It wasn't pretty. Somebody killed them. That's all we know. Them? Jessie asked, confused, not putting it all together. Cyrus nodded his large head. Your mama and Sean both. Looks like somebody broke in over at Sean's. Shot him dead. We don't know much more than that it happened, but something funny's going on, Cyrus stated flatly. When they couldn't find you, we was worried sick, so the sheriff come and got me and your grandmother to identify her. I guess Sean's brother showed up and identified him, but now they can't find him. The sheriff seems awful shook up about something, but he ain't talking. I've just been catching bits and pieces from hearing the sheriff's radio. They was taking us back home when they called in about the break-in here, so he brought us. He started crying again and hugged Jessie again. It'll be okay, child. You know your granny and I love you. Uncle Bobby too. It'll be okay, he soothed. Jessie clung tightly, a growing knot of fear rising in the pit of her stomach. Who would do something like this? She sobbed, clinging even tighter to her grandfather. Who? 3 days later. The quaint, well-kept older homes of Warrenton slipped past the tinted windows of the limousine as it approached the old, centrally located cemetery. The short procession moved through the brick and wrought iron gated entrance. The older section of the cemetery was to the right, shaded by large trees. The new sections, which were still in use, sat in the open to the left. Eric noticed none of this as he sat in the back of the funeral home limousine. He was lost in his own thoughts, and trying to hold off the crushing grief that had threatened to consume him. He thought, first Mom, then Dad, and now Sean. Why Sean? He was trying to sort out the events of the last several days. He looked up as the car stopped and noted with some surprise they had arrived. The traditional green tent at the graveside was a short distance away, and the workers and the equipment for the burial a discreet distance further still. Eric exited the limo and moved to the rear of the hearse where the pallbearers gathered. He looked them over, a hard bunch, some of Sean's ex-teammates. Their grief was etched into their faces as deeply as his own, except for the strange absence of tears. He was sure a few of them had cried privately, though none of them but himself showed the telltale, red-rimmed, bloodshot, sore eyes of someone who had shed more than their share of tears. What a hard bunch, Eric thought, to command the kind of respect these men had shown to Sean, even in death. Eric shook his head, still in awe of his brother. I can't cry in front of these men, he thought. I can't show that kind of weakness. I won't tarnish their memory of Sean by letting them think his little brother was some kind of wimp. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. He looked around again at the small group of mourners who were gathering. A couple he knew, most he didn't. He could tell by their bearing most were military or ex-military. The Navy-supplied honor guard moved in, and the rest of the service went like a choreographed play. Eric felt detached, like he was watching, not really taking part in it. Any moment he hoped Sean would come strolling up and slap him on the back, and he would wake up from the terrible nightmare. Eric accepted the tightly folded triangle flag that had adorned Sean's casket. The minister concluded the service and moved in to give a final handshake and empty words of sympathy to Eric. He was followed by most of the meager crowd. Eric was polite but detached, numbly shaking hands and saying meaningless thank yous. The sheriff clasped Eric's shoulder, expressed his regrets, then asked Eric to stop by and see him later if he was up to it. Tomorrow if not, we'll see an end to this, he stated simply as he moved off. Then an austere-looking man who was vaguely familiar to Eric shook Eric's hand and handed Eric his card. Jeff Nelson, Security International, he said in a solemn tone. Your brother worked for me. He sighed, then continued. He showed great promise. We're all going to miss him. Call me in a few days. We'll set up a time for you to come in. Thank you, sir, Eric said, trying to recall where they had met. I'm sure you're busy. I don't want to bother you. After all, Sean hadn't worked there for very long. Eric's gaze shifted, still trying to recall the meeting. Nonsense, young man. We are a very close family, and there's paperwork to tie up. Loose ends, so to speak. Your brother's insurance, his will. You see, it's required by all of our employees because of the nature of our work. I don't want to leave anybody's family wanting." He patted Eric's shoulder in a gesture as empty as his smile. "I hadn't thought of that," Eric said, shaking his head somewhat bewildered. "A lot of people don't," Nelson reassured sagely. "I didn't even realize Sean had a will," Eric thought out loud. "We take care of everything through our corporation. The insurance alone is at least $1 million. I'm sure that'll help you in the days to come," Nelson said somewhat smugly. "$1 million? Eric repeated, stunned, but somewhere in the back of his mind something clicked. Nelson already knew that he didn't know. "Call me," Nelson repeated and started to move off. "Excuse me," Eric called after him. "Yes?" Nelson said, turning, his gaze betraying nothing. "I'm sorry." Eric paused, unsure. "I'm sorry, have we met before?" Nelson paused, the smug smile fading, his face turning completely impassive. "I hardly think so, young man," he said, then turned and quickly walked away. Eric turned to follow him with his eyes, but was being spoken to by someone else. He turned his attention to an old, weathered-looking black man who also looked vaguely familiar. "I must be losing my mind," Eric thought. He turned quickly to see where Nelson went, and caught a quick glimpse of him and two very large men ducking into a Cadillac, just like the one at Sean's. The two other men looked familiar too. "God, I must be losing my mind," Eric said, this time out loud. "I'm sorry, Mr. Murphy. What did you say?" Eric turned back to look at the man he was shaking hands with. No, I'm sorry. My mind's slipping is all. I'm not myself today," Eric apologized. "I understand," the man said, nodding sagely, and regarding Eric severely with the most solemn brown eyes Eric could ever remember seeing. "Happens to me all the time. At my age, it's normal though," he added, giving a wry chuckle. "I want to express my sympathies, and those of my entire family," he intoned sincerely. "My daddy didn't do nothing," a young black teenager said, leaning into their conversation over the old man's shoulder, an angry, insolent expression etched on his young face, daring Eric to challenge his admission. "Hush now, boy. That'll be enough," the old man ordered, with iron in his voice and fire in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, turning back to Eric. "My grandson's excitable, as is most of his generation." Eric caught on, looking at the youth, then at the old man. It was like 3 different generations of the same person. The likeness was uncanny. He expected, if not for the great age difference, they'd look like triplets. "Wilton Calhoun," Eric spoke softly. "Yes, he's my son." The old man spoke with pride, straightening his shoulders defiantly. "I can assure you he was." Eric smiled, interrupting him with the wave of his hand. "I don't think he did it." The 2 generations of Calhouns before him stopped their protest of Eric's reaction on their lips to stare disbelievingly at him. "I met him briefly in the holding cell the other day. It's a long story, but I don't believe what they told me. To tell you the truth, I don't think they do either." The old man gripped Eric's hand tighter, then covered it with both of his. "God bless you, son. God bless you. We live just down the road from your brother's place. Come on by when you get a chance." He looked carefully, almost guardedly, around to see who was watching. "We need to talk." And then the 2 of them were gone, walking quickly away. Eric looked after them a moment, until one of Sean's close ex-teammates tapped him on the shoulder. Excuse me, Eric. The men and I decided we're gonna bury your brother. Not the gravediggers." He indicated to the workers who were lurking ever closer as the crowd dispersed, with a nod of his large graying head. "It's your duty as his kin to turn the first spade," he almost commanded. Eric almost said something snide to the burly SEAL, but thought better of it. Yeah, that would be nice. Sean would have liked that, he said instead. Eric stood by the mound of Sean's freshly filled grave and watched the last of his friends leave to congregate at the nearest place they could drink to their friend into the honored halls of Valhalla. As he watched the departing cars, he felt emptiness close in on him, like when his father died. Now he was truly alone. He stood for a time, then, with silent prayer, he turned and started wandering through the cemetery. He had long since dismissed the limo, saying he would catch a ride back to the funeral home, but he wanted to walk, to be alone with his thoughts. Eric wandered into the old section and soon found himself before a tall obelisk. Reading the inscription on the Confederate soldiers' monument, he watched it try to reach up into the blue spring afternoon sky. More soldiers, he thought. Well, at least you won't have to be lonely, Sean. He turned and began threading his way through the maze of assorted tombstones in all manner of shapes and sizes. He hadn't gone very far when something caught his eye to his left. "I'll be a son of a bitch," he muttered to himself, and then chuckled at the bitter irony of what he saw. Moving over, he stood before the tombstone that caught his eye and read, "Colonel John S. Mosby, 43rd Battalion, Virginia Cavalry. Born December 6, 1833. Died May 30th, 1916. A week ago I had never heard of the man. Now everywhere I go somebody asks me about him or I see his name," he muttered. "What did you have to do with Sean's death, you bastard? Huh? What secrets are you hiding?" He stared at the tombstone, not expecting an answer, then jumped when a soft voice behind him answered, "I might be able to tell you." "Holy shit!" Eric shouted, visibly startled as he turned, clutching his chest in surprise, to see the veiled figure of a young woman standing close behind him. She jumped too. His reaction to the unexpected answer scared her as much as she scared him. "Oh my God, I'm sorry," he said, getting his breath. "Hasn't anybody told you not to sneak up on people in graveyards? For Christ's sake." I didn't mean to." She sobbed and started to cry. "Oh God, I'm sorry," he said. "Hey, come on, don't cry. I can't stand to see a woman cry." Eric fumbled for her handkerchief and handed it to her as he took a closer look. "She's pretty," he thought, "and younger than I thought, too." She saw him looking at her and sniffed. "You must think me silly," she ventured, wiping her eyes. "Not at all," Eric answered. "Let me introduce myself. Eric Murphy," he said, holding out his hand, trying to be gallant. "I know who you are," she said, taking the hand and giving him a surprisingly firm handshake. "I'm Jessie, Abby's daughter." Eric's confusion must have shown on his face. She kept explaining. "You know, my mother was with your brother when... The tears started to fall again. Hey, I'm sorry," Eric consoled, moving closer. She clung to him, and he patted her back while she cried into his shoulder. He looked around self-consciously, feeling odd standing there in the middle of the cemetery, holding a girl he didn't even know. "I'm sorry," he said reassuringly. "I didn't make the connection. Sean told me about your mom, and about you, but he never told me your name. I do know he cared about her very much, even though they had only known each other a short time." The last statement started a new round of tears from both of them, and they stood clinging to each other, neither feeling quite as empty for the moment. "Whew, that's some story," Eric whistled. They walked down the quiet streets of Warrington, heading more or less toward the direction of the funeral home where Eric had left his Z-28. They had sat for some time in the cemetery, amongst the trees and old tombs. Her story had come in a disjointed rush. Only after hearing it through several times did it begin to make sense. Now they were walking back to his car, and she was explaining her last few days, from her research to the break-in at her home. "You don't believe me," she accused. "I didn't say that. I just said it was some story," he explained, trying to take it all in. "Well, you're saying it like you don't believe me," she pouted. Eric looked over at her, noticing for the first time how pretty she really was. Neither the black dress nor the veil concealed her very striking features. "Look, I want to believe you. You wouldn't believe what's happened to me since I got here Friday either. I'm not entirely sure I do." He paused. "Do you know what Sean did with the gold bar?" She looked at him and exhaled loudly. "No." "Okay, do you know where the treasure map and note got to?" "I didn't call it a treasure map," she spat defensively. "Are you mocking me?" she accused. No, of course not. Well, don't. Listen, it's a map that shows where the gold's hidden, right? Well, he prodded. Yes, she said tentatively, but clearly still defensive. Then it's a treasure map. I'm not mocking anybody. I'm just trying to get it all straight in my head, okay? He pleaded. Okay, she pouted. So to answer my question, do you? No, I don't. But I do have the diaries that make some references. You have to look back to what was going on, and who was doing what, before you accept the premise that the legend of Mosby's gold is true, and that it's somehow connected to your brother's house. Maybe the killers took it, he offered. I don't know, she said, thinking as they walked away in silence. Out of the blue, she snapped her fingers. That's it, she cried. What's it? I bet I know where Sean hid it. So, tell me, Eric said half-heartedly. Not a chance, but I'll show you where, she said, giving Eric a sly look. Not a chance, he refused flatly. As he glanced sideways at her, he saw her begin to pout again, and he gave in. Okay, deal. She stopped and held out her hand. He paused only a moment and shook her hand, smiling. Deal, okay, we've got to get to Wheatland, she said, thinking out loud. Where? That's the name of your brother's place. All the respectable antebellum homesteads had names, she explained. Oh, I don't know if we can. The sheriff has it sealed up, but Eric brightened. He said he wanted to see me in his office today or tomorrow. Maybe he was going to free it up. Well, let's go see, she said, changing her direction. Where are you going now? He asked. The sheriff's office is downtown. It's this way, she pointed. Yeah, I know where it is. Let's get my car. It'll be faster in the long run. Mr. Murphy, the sheriff said, standing, extending his hand over the large desk, shaking Eric's hand firmly. I didn't expect to see you this soon. And Miss Deacon? He greeted Jessie. I see y'all have met. Too bad it's under such terrible circumstances. By the way, girl, you'd better call your grandpa. Old Cyrus has called a dozen times in the last couple hours saying you disappeared right after your mama's service. He's worried sick, girl. The sheriff scolded. Thanks, Sheriff. I'll call him right away. You wanted to see me, Sheriff? Eric interrupted. The sheriff regarded Eric closely for a moment. Yeah, son, I did, he answered finally. He rummaged for a moment on his desk, picked up a set of keys, and tossed them to Eric. We're all done at your brother's. And I had an old couple I know clean up the mess. So if y'all go out there, you won't have to. Well, you know, the couple is on a fixed income. Their address is right here, he said, handing Eric a slip of paper. It would be a nice thing if you expressed your thanks, if you know what I mean, the sheriff said slyly, arching an eyebrow. I think I understand, Sheriff. Thanks. The sheriff dismissed him with a wave. Think nothing of it. I know we kinda got off on the wrong foot, son. It's the least I could do. But I do have a few more questions, if you would please excuse us, Miss Deacon, he said, motioning Jessie towards the door. Why, sure, Sheriff, she said, getting up. Don't go far, girl. I got a couple questions for you, too. He smiled. She closed the door on her way out. The sheriff sat a moment, regarding Eric. Pretty little thing, the sheriff observed. What's on your mind, Sheriff? Eric asked, returning to the subject. The smile left the sheriff's face, now giving Eric a serious look. Are you aware, son, that your brother left a will naming you a sole beneficiary? Left quite a hefty insurance policy, too, from what I understand. Yeah, I guess I did. Jeff Nelson mentioned it today at the cemetery. You had no knowledge of it before today? No, Sheriff, I didn't. Eric answered, meeting the sheriff's steady gaze. Okay, son, I gotta cover all the angles, you know, he said, smiling again. Yeah, sure. The sheriff ignored Eric's sarcasm and continued. Left you the house, too. Mentioned some of his Navy buddies, but said disbursement is entirely up to you. I, didn't know. All Nelson said was there was a will and insurance and to give him a call. Eric shrugged. I see. Tell you what, boy, you call him real soon before he gets his mitts on anything. I don't trust that slippery so-and-so. You be careful. Can you tell me any more about what happened to Sean? The sheriff regarded him for another long moment. Son, we're making progress. That's all I can say at this time. You mentioned about Mosby the other day? Bet a month's wages you heard since, especially now seeing you and Miss Deacon have met, about the legend of Mosby's gold, Eric kept his face impassive. I thought so. Son, it's hogwash. You hear? Hogwash. There ain't no gold hidden hereabouts. It's just an old tale. But that didn't mean someone thinking it's true didn't mess with your brother and Jesse's mama. She sure enough was running all over the countryside the last few days before the incident, asking about it to stir up some crazy notions. If you don't get my meaning, I'll spell it out for you. You take your inheritance and go home, or stay and finish restoring your brother's place. It's right nice, and he did some nice things to it while he had it. You could do worse than settling around here, but I repeat, do not trample the countryside searching for buried treasure and stir things up. I won't have you trampling on my investigation. There are a lot of wealthy people in this here county. This kind of killing makes them nervous. Me too, for that matter, he mumbled. I'll get to the bottom of it. You got my word on that. But don't go stirring up things hereabouts. You understand? Fauquier County's a quiet, peaceful place, and I aim to see it stays that way. You understand, son? Eric got to his feet. Oh, sure, I understand. You're right, Sheriff. You know my brother thought this was a quiet, peaceful place, too. Look where it got him. I'm gonna forget you said that, son, considering you're grieving and all. Now send in Miss Jessie, would you please? The sheriff shuffled some papers in front of him, dismissing Eric. Eric stood there for a moment, then headed out, slamming the door as he left, hard enough to rattle the glass inset. Your turn, he said to Jessie, who he found outside the door standing in the hall. I'll be in the car waiting.